We are the people they call boat people.
April 29, 1975. The United States withdrew troops from Vietnam, leaving the South Vietnamese who had fought so tirelessly with them for nearly 20 years, vulnerable to the forces of the North, and leading many to attempt to escape the country beginning the following day. The next day, Saigon fell to North Vietnam. Vietnam was now a communist country. Over the next 20 years, 1.5 million civilians would flee Vietnam by boat due to the fear of the Viet Cong, the communist force now occupying Vietnam, giving the refugees the name boat people. Not all would make it. The world became divided, leaving the refugees to wonder who, if anyone, would support them after they left their lives behind. As refugees from Laos and Cambodia also fled their countries, a total of 3 million people were made refugees, becoming one of the longest and largest refugee crises in history. There is a long history of Asian immigration to the United States. It can be traced back to one of the first mass immigrations of Chinese people in the 1850s, when they came to America as laborers, mainly working on railroads, in gold mines, and in factories. Tension formed between the Americans and Chinese as the Chinese improved their socioeconomic status. In 1882, President Arthur passed the Chinese Exclusion Act, which banned all Chinese laborers from immigrating to the United States. This incited what would become a nearly 150-year-long history of Asian American discrimination in the United States. Following the attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941, American anti-Asian American sentiment became strikingly obvious, and the norm, especially for the Japanese laborers who had moved to the United States prior to World War II. On February 19, 1942, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt issued Executive Order 9066. Military commanders took advantage of it by claiming the Japanese were a threat, leading to the opening of internment camps where over 112,000 people with Japanese roots, including 70,000 American citizens, would be forced to remain for up to 3 years. This alludes to the fact that the continued discrimination against Asians became widely tolerated and accepted. The United States was involved in the Cold War throughout the 50s and 60s. The United States feared communism, the spread of which could be described by the term domino theory, in which if one country fell to communism, neighboring countries would do the same. This made the primary goal of the United States to contain communism. It led the United States to insert themselves into the Vietnam War in 1955, siding with South Vietnam, who was attempting to defend itself from the communists from North Vietnam, also called the Viet Cong. It became known that if Saigon, the capital of Vietnam chosen by the South, fell to the North, the war would be over. Despite the divide, the goal of both sides was to unify Vietnam.
The communists control us by fear.
Everywhere the communists conquered, concentration camps, known as re-education camps, followed. People were terrified of being sent to one.
My father said best that say nothing, trust no one, keep your head down.
Those who were sentenced to a re-education camp were often worked to death. Those who attempted to escape were shot dead or tortured. The United States military was a powerful force and soon became the one holding South Vietnam's land from the hands of the North. The South Vietnamese government was weak, so as Americans began advising the South Vietnamese government on how to strike, the American and South Vietnamese forces were able to combine and fight side by side. It was no use, and it became clear that the Americans were fighting a fated war. The United States came to the devastating decision to turn their backs on the Vietnamese they had been fighting for and alongside for years. On March 29, 1973, Nixon began removing American forces from Vietnam. April 30th, Saigon falls. The war is over. The United Nations Conference at Geneva on July 20th and 21st, 1979, was called to debate possible solutions to the refugee crisis facing the world from Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, 3 countries that had been taken over or were being threatened by communism. Refugees began escaping by boat, leading to the name boat people, which was a dangerous prospect. Pirates, drowning, dehydration, and starvation were all possibilities that faced every boat person. They would go through the South China Sea to first asylums, or places with refugee camps where they could stay temporarily, including Malaysia, the Philippines, Indonesia, and Thailand, before legally taking a plane to a full asylum where they could resettle permanently, such as the US, the UK, France, Australia, or Canada. In 1975, the United States passed the Indochina Migration and Refugee Assistance Act, which promised an evacuation and resettlement program to refugees escaping Vietnam and Cambodia, as well as Laos later on. It added up to over $400 million. The first wave of refugees was received eagerly and was supported by Americans, though it was possibly due to guilt for abandoning the Vietnamese. Soon, though, the crisis became too large for just a few countries to handle on their own when a second, larger wave of immigrants faced the United States. They were received much more harshly, a reaction many considered to be due to them being less like Americans. They couldn't speak English, and they had very little money. Either way, the situation had become too large for just a few countries to handle on their own, which led to the international involvement and the UN meeting being convened. The United Nations discussed problems about what to do with too many refugees and not enough places to go. Two of the main questions debated were, should support be provided for immigrants or not, and how should immigrants be supported? The representatives from the countries represented as part of the United Nations came to agreements and offered support to immigrants traveling through countries represented at the meeting. The meeting was convened just 2 years after Vietnam became part of the UN. Cambodia and Laos had both joined in 1955. A number of resolutions were made at the meeting. 260,000 places were now open for refugee resettlement, up from 125,000 in May. A new 50,000-person refugee processing center was offered in addition to program expansion for organized departure from Vietnam, and attainable proposals related to the issue of ocean rescue for boat people were created. Even the Philippines said that with funding from the UN, they could create another processing center that could hold up to 50,000 refugees. The United Nations conference was historically significant because it changed the lives of the Vietnamese refugees and moved them all over the world. One of the successes that came out of it was the Refugee Act of 1980 that was passed in the United States, which allowed more refugees to immigrate to the United States. The Refugee Act allowed many people to build a new life in a new country. At the UN meeting, the United States had pledged a total of $160 million to assist refugees. One of the failures was the lack of help for those in need, as well as the time it took to act. It wasn't until 4 years after the Vietnam War ended that international aid was administered. Many countries had previously debated humanitarian aid from if they could help to how they could, but many people died in the meantime. Even those who did make it to a new place had to deal with inhumane conditions on the boat where people could die at any point. However, it also made more countries work together, as shown at the UN conference. It also proved the sympathy that many American citizens had.
So a group of the 10 women who in the Bible study, they looked through it and they said they want to rescue us. And so they did the paperwork and to sponsor our family. So in November of 1979, we came to America.
Long-term consequences were many people being safe in new countries and having to build a new life in a new country. While they were safer, it terrified many who couldn't speak the language of their new country.
We know exactly what we run away from, but we don't know what we're running toward.
Others didn't understand the new form of government or how certain laws could help them. It also connects to the immigration crisis currently facing the United States. The Refugee Act of 1980 has created lasting change for many refugees. American Congress continued to support the refugees from Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, with the addition of Korea and Thailand, with the Amer-Asian Act in 1982, which allowed anyone born in one of those countries between 1951 and October 1982, with the father of American citizenship, to become a permanent resident of the United States. This was due to a high number of children being born of American soldiers while they were fighting overseas. Unfortunately, the continued acceptance of anti-Asian hate, as well as anti-Asian rhetoric and the model minority myth, is still on the rise. The international support from the UN meeting has continued to influence refugee policy, especially in the United States, as help for refugees continues, especially for migrants from Afghanistan and Syria, who are currently being impacted by the Refugee Act of 1980. American Congress's reaction to Vietnamese immigration set a precedent of the United States opening their arms to refugees. The meeting on refugees and displaced persons in Southeast Asia, held at Geneva in 1979, 4 years after Saigon fell to the communists, was a crucial and impactful event that changed the way refugees were being treated and supported across the world. Vietnamese citizens suffered through concentration camps and the trauma of illegally escaping their home by boat, as well as refugee camps, before being able to settle on their own in a new country where they couldn't speak the language. Those who didn't escape were abandoned in Vietnam under communist rule. The consequences of the UN meeting provided many benefits to them, including more refugee camps to reside in temporarily. It successfully brought around awareness for the Asian Americans who were physically suffering, though the failure to remedy the psychological harm caused by Asian hate has continued to today. Despite the immense progress made during the Vietnamese refugee crisis, the debate on refugee support continues today.